All right, so hello, welcome back. So today we're obviously doing part two of the Congress of Vienna. And we are just going to pick up right where we left off. The original video in the description. This is the longer form version with me adding input. So I pause. Otherwise, thank you to my patrons. And again, the original video in the description if you want to go watch that first and give them a like there. Otherwise, let us continue.
I mentioned the Austrian foreign minister before, and how he had a rather dim opinion of the Russian Tsar. Biggest baby on earth, and all that. The Austrian foreign minister's name was Clemens von Metternich, and the period we're beginning to cover today is sometimes called the Age of Metternich. That's a clue as to his importance. Metternich would become the architect of the post-war international system, and one of the 19th century's most preeminent figures. Metternich's task was vastly harder than it seemed, because not only was the international system undergoing a stark transformation at the time, but so was Austria. Of course, what I'm referencing here is the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. And now my punishment for bringing up the Holy Roman Empire is that I have to explain what it was. We should begin with the French philosopher Voltaire's famous quip that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. So,
And if you play EU4 and you know what Voltaire's nightmare is, it's the entire HRE.
what was it? The Holy Roman Empire was a Central European institution that had existed in one form or another for over 1,000 years. I say institution because the Holy Roman Empire was by no means a state. Each member of the empire conducted its own foreign policy, with its own military, under its own laws. Hundreds of tiny states were members of this club, this institution, and together they
It was also neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire. As you can see, this is why it's not an empire.
loosely supported a central emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was a prestigious title with very little actual power behind it. He could call for aid if one of the member states was attacked, but it was up to each independent state whether or not they would respond. In fact, each state had its own unique deal worked out with the imperial crown, which put further limits on the emperor's power. Some were expected to contribute money to military campaigns, but no soldiers. Some were expected to contribute soldiers, but no money. Some were under no obligation to offer anything at all. By the 17th century, the Holy Roman Emperor could no longer even have an opinion on religious matters, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the holy part of their title.
We are skipping the, let's just say, the Catholics versus the Protestants and killing hundreds of thousands, if not a million or more people in the 1600s to discuss the issue of is the HRE Protestant, Catholic, or what is the deal there, basically.
Although the imperial crown was remarkably weak, the Holy Roman Emperor usually controlled the most powerful state within the empire. Beginning in the 15th century and continuing up until the Napoleonic Wars, that meant that the Holy Roman Emperor was the Archduke of Austria. Since the 13th century, Austria had been controlled by the Habsburg family. The Habsburgs were one of the most powerful families in Europe, and at times over the last 500 years, they had controlled Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Germany, parts of northern Italy, Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, I could go on. The dynasty was remarkably successful, and what made it especially remarkable is that very little of this territory was gained through conquest. It was instead gained diplomatically. The Austrian Habsburgs had a family motto: "Let others wage war, but thou, happy Austria, marry. For those kingdoms that Mars gives to others, Venus gives to thee." Others conquer through war. The Habsburgs conquer through marriage. Fast forward to the 19th century. The Holy Roman Emperor was still an Austrian Habsburg, now facing an expansionist France under Napoleon. He learned too late that the Holy Roman Empire was not equipped to face a direct attack. A victorious...
The last thing I'll bring up about the Habsburgs is, again, Spain, Habsburg. Again, when you have all those Habsburgs, family members, you can negotiate a lot of alliances. And that's how a lot of stuff was done, really, until mid-1700s, a little bit before. was basically monarchs. There was no real state or nation. You didn't belong to them. You belonged to a kingdom or a monarchy. And that's how a lot of the diplomacy was done until around the mid 1700s, 1600s, really. And then it starts to be iffy there.
Napoleon demanded the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Habsburg Emperor, having decided that this powerless husk was no longer worth defending, agreed. With that, Austria became fully independent under its first emperor, Francis I.
I want you to take a look at just how big this Austria is, okay? This will become Austria-Hungary. You have Illyria down here. You have Croatia up here. You have Bohemia. You have Poland. You have probably a little bit of Romania down here. You have Hungary here. You have a lot of people here in this empire that don't speak the same language.
I lay all of that groundwork because by 1814, Austria was at a crossroads. The new Empire of Austria had played a critical role in the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. But now what? They could reform the Holy Roman Empire if they wished, but did they wish? When push came to shove, some of the largest members of the empire sided with Napoleon. If the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a military alliance, what good was it? Yes, the title was prestigious, but you could argue that the restrictions within the empire only slowed Austria down, with no clear benefit. Francis, the former Holy Roman Emperor, and the current Austrian Emperor, was sympathetic to this point of view, as was his foreign minister, Metternich. Metternich is sometimes described as a conservative or a reactionary, but that's not quite right. A true reactionary would have fought to reform the Holy Roman Empire, but Metternich happily allowed it to die. He was a realist, not that concerned with ideology, so long as it protected his hard-won peace. In his excellent and definitive biography of Metternich, Wolfram Zeeman writes that, quote, "This, the question of whether Metternich was reactionary, disregards the experiences of human beings who were looking back at 25 years of war and revolution. The question contemporary witnesses asked themselves was whether the more than 3 million dead on the battlefields of Europe had died for any meaningful goal. In many peasant families, there were no male youths left."
Just think about that in peasant families, because again, lower people usually have to fight the wars that the higher people start. There were no males left. That means no children. That means no passing the name along. No generation. Nothing. Family dies out when that happens, and that is absolutely devastating for families. And to think again, 3 million. We don't exactly know how many died in the Napoleonic Wars. Throw the number out that you think is good, and probably is a good answer. I mean, there's not a real way to know with the amount of people that had to die from the French Revolution on to basically 1815. We just don't know. It's a lot of people, though.
That 3 million number is on the lower end of the spectrum. I've seen credible estimates of 5 to 7 million when you include civilians. Unthinkable loss. Nobody who lived through this period would ever be the same. Across France, 20% of the men born between 1790 and 1795 were dead. An entire generation of young men had been wiped out.
And that's going to have echoes, again, as I've said in many videos, echoes throughout generations, right? Again, France is the second most populous country in Europe. Russia is the first. And you're going to see that there's going to be a slow decline of the population. Just going to start, they're going to start losing their position because Germany forms, and a whole bunch of stuff. But this is one of the factors that will lead to the population not exactly increasing as much as other powers, because again, 20% of their male population, their youth, died in the Napoleonic Wars.
In that same book, Zeeman provides the best summary of Metternich's worldview that I've ever seen. In Metternich's case, coming to terms with the war meant considering the suffering he had witnessed endless times on the battlefields and along the roads. Unnecessary, pointless, even a crime, caused by human delusions of grandeur that, he thought, could pull down the walls protecting civilization and the law as he understood it, at any time and in any place. It was the duty of politics to erect enduring barriers against this possibility. He opposed this catastrophe on humanitarian grounds, and his lasting commitment was never again. Metternich saw balance between great powers as the answer.
And this is a sentiment that's actually shared at the Treaty of Versailles. It was basically, we cannot just be like this. There needs to be a reason for this never to happen again. Now, Versailles fails for a lot of reasons, but their original goal was never again. We don't want a war like this ever again. And then the peace process happened with a whole bunch of political shenanigans that I don't want to get into here. But again, he has the same philosophy. We can't just let 5 to 7 million people or 3 million people die in vain. There needs to be something out of this so we don't do this again.
He feared a second French Revolution, or something like it, but he couldn't clearly see how Austria could possibly prevent one. However, with a balanced international system, any state seeking to dominate could simply be slapped down by everybody else. This theory for peace played into Austrian strengths. Ever since the French Revolution, Austria had positioned itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law. Accordingly, they began to expand their diplomatic influence and cultivate a following of smaller states, especially in Central Europe, who feared being swallowed up by the regional instability that would inevitably follow the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. Before proceeding, it would be helpful to discuss what the Austrian Empire actually was. What we're really talking about here is the personal holdings of the Habsburg family, which included the lands that had been the Duchy of Austria, but it also included the Kingdom of Hungary, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Croatia, along with a hodgepodge of other titles. It may be helpful to look at the ethnic breakdown of the Austrian Empire.
Oh boy, here we go.
Because this will tell you everything you need to know about Austrian politics. First and foremost, there was the German-speaking core, centered around Vienna and the old Duchy of Austria. Then there were the Magyars of Hungary, who spoke Hungarian. The third major group were the Bohemians, who spoke Czech. Then in the borderlands, there were Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, and others who spoke various Slavic languages. To the east, there was Transylvania, whose inhabitants spoke Romanian. There were also regions where the majority spoke Polish and Ukrainian, and although this wasn't the case at this exact moment, the Austrian Empire would soon have a large Italian minority as well.
Yep. And this will be one of the reasons Austria is very inefficient in World War I and actually breaks down is because of this cultural makeup and languages.
By one count, the Austrian Empire consisted of 14 ethnic groups speaking 17 different languages. The Austrian Empire was really an incredible experiment, one that you don't see anywhere else in the 19th century. This was not the case of one ethnic group dominating their neighbors. This was a true synthesis of cultures and ethnicities, united under the Habsburg Emperor. In the eyes of the Habsburg Emperor, all of these holdings were, at least theoretically, co-equal, which made administering the empire the world's most complicated balancing act.
Okay, kind of. So it was always German dominated. Now, when it will be called the Austrian Empire, and then it will be called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because Hungary is a major part of this empire, and they wanted, co-equal status. Which, fun fact, they didn't get, which is why they formed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Bohemians, Galicians, Croatians, Italians, Romanians, all the ethnic groups, they were not seen as equals. Okay, however, this empire is still extraordinary in the fact that it survived for so long and still was a major power, okay? And you could even make an argument in the case that it might have even survived to today if certain things happened. Those certain things, the son, Austria's heir, doesn't get shot by a Serbian nationalist Black Hand member and actually follows his father dies and he becomes emperor and pushes through his reforms, which was, let's actually try to make this a federalized state, which would be a very early form of an EU, kind of, or maybe even a United States, where each one of these is an actual state and they have a federal diet, right? And they all send members there and they all work out their problems. That would have been very interesting to see. And it also is not I won't say it's like likely. I'll just say that it's not unlikely that that would have happened if the heir obviously wasn't shot. Now, you could do just a whole thesis on just that part, but I've talked to Bohemians. I've talked to, well, Czechs. Let's put it that way. The Czechs and the Slovaks have various disagreements, but they actually liked the empire. So let's put it that way. And it would have been a very powerful United States of Greater Austria, United States of Bohemia, Austria, Galicia, Croatia. Again, it depends on what it is, but it was a possibility, is all I'm trying to say. And it's extraordinary that it survived as long as it did.
The constraints within the Habsburg system become clear when you look at the crown's relationship with the Kingdom of Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary was home to more than just the ethnic Hungarian population, and when you add everybody together, it accounted for 35 to 40% of the Austrian Empire's total population. That fact alone should make it clear why there was tension between the Austrian Germans and the Hungarians. The Habsburg Emperor ruled Hungary as their king, but he was not one of them, and so he was bound by severe constitutional limitations. One of these limitations was that the Hungarian king was not allowed to tax the people of Hungary. The local Hungarian aristocracy was allowed to tax the people, but they were under no obligation to pass that money along to their king. Again, this is 35 to 40% of the empire's population we're talking about. This exemption created a massive hole in the imperial budget that Austria was constantly trying to fill. Over the centuries, this arrangement resulted in the Hungarian aristocracy becoming extremely rich, even though the Hungarian people remained quite poor compared to the German-speaking population to the west. The Hungarian king was also constrained when it came to military recruitment. Despite being home to 35 to 40% of the Austrian Empire, Hungarian subjects only made up like 5% of its military. This number could fluctuate. During the Napoleonic Wars, it climbed as high as 20%, but in order to accomplish that, the Habsburg Emperor had to go to the Hungarian aristocracy and give them whatever they wanted. This tenuous constitutional relationship meant that Austria was cursed in a way to be in constant negotiations with itself. The Hungarians were always suspicious of any territorial gains that added more ethnic Germans to the empire. The whole political system was a delicate balance, and if the ethnic Germans got something, the Hungarians always wanted something too.
Which is, again, a reason the Austro-Hungarian Empire will be actually called that, and it will be like a dual kingdom bajigger with an emperor that's Austria. It's a very complicated stuff, but yeah.
Despite all of its contradictions, the Austrian Empire had a lot of credibility on the international stage. Whatever the reasons, the fact that Austria was not primarily concerned with territorial expansion mattered a lot, especially to all of those tiny Central European states who had recently been made vulnerable by the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. It meant that despite having the weakest military of the great powers, Austria had a lot of friends, at a time when having a lot of friends was a valuable thing to have. None of this was true of the other German great power. In many ways, Austria's mirror opposite. Where Austria was old, they were young. Where Austria was defined by their diversity, they were defined by their Germanness. Where Austria was weaker militarily than they could be, they were stronger militarily than they ought to be. Where Austria was not that interested in territorial expansion, they were obsessed with it to the point where they thought of very little else. The two German great powers were brothers, but they were brothers that did not get along.
I like his summarization of Prussia. It's pretty freaking accurate.
In 1814, the thing that defined Prussia was its precarity. It was the smallest of the great powers in every way. It had a tiny population of 10 million people, 3 times less populous than France, and almost 5 times less populous than Russia. It was also small geographically. As you can see, its tiny population was crammed into a bunch of isolated pockets that weren't even connected to each other. It was also precarious in its positioning. As I've already discussed, Central Europe was no longer under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire, which meant that tiny Prussia was now vulnerable to its much larger neighbors. Vulnerable might be underselling it. The Prussians had enlisted Russian help against the French, but now there were Russians everywhere. Poland was under joint Russian and Prussian occupation, but there were also Russians occupying the Polish-speaking areas of eastern Prussia, and they weren't leaving. The Russians were also occupying Saxony along Prussia's southern border, and these guys weren't leaving either.
Does this sound familiar? Where forces occupy a certain area and then refuse to leave?
Central Europe was in a state of flux. It was clear to everybody that Russia saw opportunity here, which was entirely antithetical to the balance of power principle. The other great powers would have no choice but to respond. In the eyes of people like Metternich and Castlereagh, Russia had to remove itself from Central Europe if there was ever to be peace. Prussia had to become the kind of great power that was capable of resisting Russian influence.
Which they will eventually become, Germany, but they have to go a long way. But you can see Russia's always trying to expand. That is one of its core tenets is expansion. It's never been sit there and be isolated. No. Always been expansion. That's what I have learned about Russia through many college courses at this point.
That was the priority of the Prussian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Karl August von Hardenberg. The experience with Napoleon had taught Hardenberg that Prussia was not yet a true great power. It was powerful regionally, but it was too small to have a global impact. In order to graduate from a regional power to a great power, Prussia needed people, Prussia needed resources, and Prussia needed territory. This line between a strong regional power and a weak great power is a fuzzy one.
It's a fuzzy one, but it makes graduating to a great power is, again, a necessity for playing the great game, which is world politics. And again, territory, so the people need people, resources, territory. You take territory, resources, and people come with it. So that's what they're going to try to get out of the Congress. Is they want territory that is German-speaking, which is relatively easy because they're all next to German-speaking people. And then they'll get the resources and the people they need to continue to become more powerful militarily, really. Not exactly a hunky-dory kind of sit on your laurels and build economically. Even my great friends, the Bavarians, they don't like the Prussians because they see them as, very uptight and militarily focused. So,
Power and a weak great power is a fuzzy one. Eric Hobsbawm writes that, quote, Austria and Prussia were really great powers by courtesy only. Continuing later, their chief function was to act as European stabilizers. It's true that Austria and Prussia could not match the global influence of France, Britain, and Russia. I would quibble slightly and say that Austria's diplomatic influence at this time made them a great power, but it's true that Prussia lacked the global reach of any of the other powers.
And they were still made a great power for the Congress, because Britain, France, Russia, nobody doubts they're great powers. Austria, diplomatically speaking, it is a great power, and it has a lot of land, so I would consider it a great power. Prussia is one of those iffy ones. It doesn't have a lot of territory, but it's still one of the biggest powers that did fight against Napoleon. You could compare it to Sweden, but it has a larger population than Sweden. So yeah, they're kind of like a courtesy great power at the table.
The only reason everybody decided to treat them as a great power was their formidable military. By the end of the war, on a per capita basis, Prussia was fielding 6 times more soldiers than Austria, which meant that despite their relative weakness, they were capable of going toe-to-toe with any other great power. Hardenberg saw in Prussia an urgent need for territorial expansion. All of these isolated enclaves would not do. They were just asking to be swallowed up by some stronger power. In the upcoming peace conference, Prussia hoped to gain some territorial coherence and become a true great power with global influence.
So those are the Prussians set up. So now we have set up basically every single power and what they want. And now we're going to go into the Congress.
The original plan was for the four victorious great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, to dominate the peace conference and impose their will upon everyone else. But Tsar Alexander's behavior had begun to make people nervous, and Russia's creeping domination over Prussia seemed a disaster waiting to happen. If there was a serious split at the conference, with Britain and Austria on one side and Russia and Prussia on the other, it was difficult to imagine how they could possibly resolve it without descending into another war. Metternich and Castlereagh saw this looming crisis before them, and so they approached Talleyrand and asked him to represent France at Vienna. France remained a great power, and so it made very little sense to exclude them from shaping the post-war world. Besides, Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated and removed from power, which meant that France was theoretically a normal country again.
Theoretically. And remember, these 5 people are about to make 100 years of history. More than that. Just 5 people, just again, think about that. Just 5 people are going to shape European history for around 100 years, whatever they come out with this with.
Naturally, nothing could have pleased Talleyrand more. Castlereagh and Metternich pulled in Hardenberg of Prussia, who was still keen on finding a way to resist Russian influence, and got him to agree. This left Tsar Alexander isolated, when the 4 other great powers came to him and demanded that France be given a seat at the Congress. He, of course, threw a fit, but then reluctantly agreed.
I like how they've already figured a way out how to deal with a man-child. They've been like, look, dude, we're all going to agree that you're stupid and you're a bonehead, so we're all going to agree to make sure that France comes in here so that we can, overpower you in case of any tiebreakers and be like, listen here, sir. Everyone else agrees, and we all have the power behind us, so you sit in the corner and shut up.
Over the summer, everybody traveled to Vienna. And by everybody, I mean everybody. Virtually every state in Europe sent delegations. And some states that didn't even exist anymore sent delegations as well. After decades of war, a festive, slightly euphoric mood took over the city. Peace was at hand. When September rolled around, the real work began.
All right, so it's an amazing video by History Syphilis. We're making progress on the Congress of Vienna. So hope you guys like my reaction to the video. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, so you're notified when the next video comes out. And if you would like to become a Patreon member to suggest videos and such like that, then that is in the description. Otherwise, the part 2 of this series, or part 3, whatever, we're looking at Congress of Vienna part 2. Up there, my reaction. So click on that when it's out. Otherwise, I'll see you people later.